The thunderclap split the sky as Hannah Montgomery stood on the precipice of her newly acquired land, her face as hard and unforgiving as the drought-ridden soil beneath her boots. At 24, she had traveled nearly 2,000 miles to escape a past that clung to her like a shadow, vowing with each mile that crossed beneath the wagon wheels that no man would ever again hear her voice or claim a piece of her heart. The year was 1876, and the Montana Territory stretched before her like a promise wild, untamed, and blessedly empty. Rain pelted her face, but Hannah remained unmoved, her gaze fixed on the dilapidated cabin that was to be her new beginning. The property had cost her every last penny from the sale of her parents' farm back east, but it was hers alone. No husband to dictate her movements. No man to betray her trust. Just Hannah, the vast sky, and the unspoken oath that had carried her across the continent. She gathered her sodden skirts and trudged toward the cabin, her single trunk of possessions already deposited inside by the wagon driver who'd brought her from town. The leaking roof and crumbling chimney would need immediate attention, but Hannah had never shied away from hard work. As she reached the warped wooden door, she cast one final glance at the horizon where mountains rose like jagged teeth against the darkening sky. This would be her sanctuary, her redemption. What she didn't realize was that the coming winter would be the harshest in 30 years, and that survival in this beautiful, brutal landscape would require more than just stubborn silence and the fierce independence she clutched like a shield. 3 weeks later, Hannah stared at the crumbling remnants of what had once been her root cellar. The torrential autumn rains had weakened the already precarious hillside behind her cabin, sending mud and stone cascading through the rough-hewn wooden structure where she'd stored the meager supplies she'd managed to purchase in town. Potatoes, flour, dried beans, and salted pork all now buried under a foot of mud and debris. Hannah didn't cry. She hadn't shed tears since that terrible day back in Ohio when everything she believed about love and loyalty had shattered like glass. Instead, she methodically picked through the wreckage, salvaging what she could and calculating how long her remaining supplies might last. The answer was grim. 2 weeks, perhaps 3 if she rationed carefully. The winter snows would arrive soon, cutting off the 10-mile trail to the nearest settlement. She worked until her fingers were raw and bleeding, unearthing a sack of flour that was only partially soaked and a few potatoes that might be salvageable if she cut away the bruised portions. When she finally straightened, her back aching from the labor, Hannah caught sight of a rider approaching from the west. Her first instinct was to retreat inside her cabin and bar the door. In the 3 weeks since her arrival, she'd encountered only the occasional traveler passing through a corner of the territory, and she'd managed to avoid direct interaction through a combination of written notes and curt nods. The shopkeepers in town already thought her odd, the mute woman who would only communicate through hastily scribbled messages, but Hannah preferred their confusion to breaking her vow. The rider drew closer, and Hannah could see it was a man astride a muscular chestnut gelding. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. As he approached, he raised a hand in greeting, and Hannah noticed he wore no gun belt, unusual for these parts where most men carried at least one firearm. She remained frozen beside the ruined cellar, her hands clenched at her sides. The stranger reined his horse to a stop a respectful distance away. "Afternoon, madam," he called, his voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "Looks like you've had some trouble here." Hannah stared stonily at him, offering no response. Let him think her rude. Let him ride away and leave her to her solitude. The man swung down from his saddle, landing lightly despite his tall frame. He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of sun-bleached wheat and eyes that reminded Hannah of the sky just before sunset, neither fully blue nor gray, but something caught between the two. "Name's Yates Blackwood," he said, approaching slowly as if sensing her wariness. "I've got a spread about 5 miles west of here." He gestured toward the collapsed cellar. Was writing fence lines when I saw the slide from up on the ridge. Thought I might lend a hand if you need it. Hannah shook her head firmly and turned away, hoping he'd take the hint. Instead, she heard his footsteps following her. Begging your pardon, madam, but winter's coming on fast this year. Losing your stores this close to the first snow. He let the words hang in the air, their implication clear. It was a death sentence for someone unprepared. Hannah marched to her cabin door, retrieved the small slate and chalk she kept for such unwanted encounters, and wrote with quick, angry strokes, "I don't need help. Please leave." Yates read the message, his expression shifting from concern to curiosity. "You can't speak." Hannah hesitated, then wrote, "Won't. Not to you. Not to any man." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by something that looked dangerously like compassion. Hannah hated it instantly. She didn't want his pity or his assumptions about what had led her to this choice. "Fair enough," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "But that cellar needs rebuilding before the ground freezes, and you need supplies to get through winter." He gestured to the distant mountains. "I've seen 12 winters in this territory, and I can tell you this one's shaping up to be mean." First snow's already dusted the high country. Hannah turned the slate around and tapped insistently at her previous message. Yates sighed. "I respect your choice not to speak, madam, but I can in good conscience ride away knowing you're facing winter with no provisions. My father raised me better than that." He glanced at the sky, where the afternoon was already fading toward evening. "I'll be back tomorrow with supplies and tools to rebuild that cellar, properly this time. You don't have to say a word to me, don't have to acknowledge me at all, if that's your preference. But I won't have your death on my conscience when a few days' work could prevent it." Before Hannah could protest further, he was back in the saddle, tipping his hat to her before turning his horse toward the west. She watched him go, fuming at his presumption and fighting the unwelcome realization that he was right. Without help, her chances of surviving the winter were slim. Hannah spent a restless night alternating between anger at the stranger's intrusion and grudging acknowledgement of her predicament. By dawn, she had decided that she would accept his assistance, but only the bare minimum required to secure her survival. She would make it abundantly clear that his help did not entitle him to her conversation or her company. True to his word, Yates Blackwood returned the next morning. He wasn't alone. A wagon followed behind him, driven by an elderly man with a weathered face and a shock of white hair beneath a battered hat. "Morning," Yates called as he dismounted. "This here's Elijah. Works for me, but he's the best carpenter in 3 counties. Hannah nodded stiffly at the old man, who returned the gesture with a gap-toothed smile. "Boss says you don't talk to menfolk," Elijah said, climbing down from the wagon with surprising agility for his apparent age. "That's all right by me. My wife claims I'd talk enough for 2 people anyhow." Hannah couldn't help the small twitch of her lips at his good-natured acceptance. She gestured toward the collapsed cellar, then walked to her cabin to retrieve her slate. When she returned, the men had already unloaded tools from the wagon and were surveying the damage. Yates was pointing out how the water had undermined the original structure. "It wasn't dug deep enough and the drainage is all wrong," he was saying. "No wonder it collapsed in the first heavy rain." Hannah scribbled on her slate and held it up. "I appreciate the help, but I can pay for supplies only after next harvest." Yates read it and shook his head. "Consider it neighborly assistance. Out here, we look after each other. You'd do the same if our positions were reversed." Hannah frowned and wrote again. "I insist on repaying. I don't accept charity." "It's not charity, madam. It's survival." Yates gestured to the supplies in the wagon. "Besides, most of this is from my own stores. Had a good harvest this year, and there's more than enough to share." Hannah wanted to argue further, but knew it would be pointless. Instead, she wrote, "How long will rebuilding take?" 3 days, give or take," Elijah answered, already measuring and marking where the new cellar would be positioned. Doing it right this time. Needs proper drainage and reinforced walls. Hannah nodded and wrote, I can help. Appreciate that, Yates said, removing his coat and rolling up his sleeves. We'll have you set for winter before the first real snow flies. True to their estimate, the work took 3 days of backbreaking labor. Hannah worked alongside the men, digging, hauling lumber, and mixing mortar for the stone foundation. She was no stranger to physical work, having managed her parents' farm alone after their passing, but even she was impressed by the efficiency with which Yates and Elijah tackled the project. By the end of the 3rd day, Hannah had a new root cellar twice the size of the original, properly positioned on higher ground with drainage channels to divert any future flooding. It was stocked with enough provisions to last well into spring: flour, sugar, beans, corn, potatoes, salt pork, coffee, and even some preserves that Yates mentioned came from his housekeeper's summer canning. As the men prepared to leave, Hannah felt an unfamiliar sensation in her chest, gratitude mingled with something dangerously close to regret that their presence would no longer punctuate her days. She had maintained her silence throughout their work, communicating only through her slate when absolutely necessary. Yet somehow, without her noticing, the men had respected her boundaries while simultaneously breaching the walls of her isolation. She wrote a final message before they departed. Thank you. I won't forget this kindness. Yates read it and smiled, the expression transforming his weather-roughened face into something Hannah found herself unable to look away from. Winter's long in these parts, he said. I'll check in from time to time, if that's all right with you, just to make sure you're faring well. Hannah hesitated, then nodded once, reluctantly. As the wagon and rider disappeared into the gathering dusk, Hannah stood outside her cabin, watching until they were nothing more than shadows against the darkening horizon. For the first time since arriving in Montana, she felt something other than grim determination. It was a dangerous feeling, one that threatened the protective shell she'd built around herself. She turned and walked back into her cabin, shutting the door firmly behind her as if to lock out not just the approaching night, but also the unwelcome warmth that had begun to thaw the edges of her frozen resolve. The first snow came a week later, transforming the landscape into a glistening white expanse that sparkled in the winter sunlight. Hannah woke to find drifts piled against her cabin door and the world muffled under a blanket of white. The temperature had plummeted overnight, and she was grateful for the woodpile Yates had insisted on stacking beneath the lean-to-shelter adjacent to her cabin. She spent the day organizing her supplies and reinforcing the cabin's drafty windows with strips of cloth. The structure was sound, but it had clearly stood empty for some time before she purchased it, and there were countless small repairs needed to make it truly habitable for the harsh Montana winter. 3 days passed without another human being in sight. Hannah told herself she preferred it this way: the solitude, the quiet, the freedom to move through her days answering to no one. Yet each morning, she found herself glancing toward the western horizon before catching herself and deliberately turning away. On the 4th day, as Hannah was using her axe to break through the frozen surface of the stream that ran near her property, she heard the now familiar sound of hoofbeats approaching. She straightened, pushing a strand of hair back beneath her woolen cap, and saw Yates riding toward her, leading a second horse laden with packages. Hannah set her axe aside and walked to meet him, her slate tucked into the pocket of her heavy coat. She'd anticipated his return, had even, in moments of weakness, found herself looking forward to it, but she was determined to maintain the boundaries she'd established. "Morning, Miss Montgomery," Yates called, using the name he'd seen on the deed papers while they were rebuilding the cellar. "Thought I'd check how you weathered the first snow." Hannah withdrew her slate and wrote, "Well enough. The cellar is sound." "Glad to hear it." He dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow. "Brought you something from town. Mail coach got through yesterday." Hannah frowned, confused. She wasn't expecting any deliveries. Yates untied one of the packages from the pack horse. Ordered these when I first saw your place.
Hope you don't mind.
Figured they might be useful. Inside the package were glass panes for her window's real glass, not the oiled paper she'd been using to let in light while blocking the worst of the draft. There was also a small iron stove, more efficient than the open hearth that currently served as her only source of heat and cooking. Hannah stared at the items, then at Yates. His thoughtfulness left her momentarily speechless, even by her own choice. Finally, she wrote, "Why?" Yates looked uncomfortable for the first time since she'd met him. He adjusted his hat and cleared his throat. "Like I said, neighbors look out for each other out here. Nobody makes it alone."
He paused.
"And winter nights get mighty cold. Proper windows and a good stove make all the difference." Hannah studied him, searching for ulterior motives in his sun-weathered face. She found none, only a straightforward concern that made her own defensiveness seem suddenly childish. She wrote, "I can't accept such expensive gifts." "Not gifts," Yates replied promptly.
"Trade.
Your property has the best stand of sugar maples I've seen in this territory. Come spring, I'd like permission to tap them for sap. In exchange, consider the windows and stove payment in advance." Hannah knew the maple trees he referred to, a small grove on the eastern edge of her property. She hadn't considered their value beyond firewood. She wrote, "Deal," and held out her hand to shake on it before she could reconsider. Yates looked surprised at the gesture, but took her hand in his. Even through her gloves, Hannah could feel the strength in his grip. She withdrew quickly, unsettled by the contact. "I'll help install these before I go," he offered. "Won't take long with 2 pairs of hands." Hannah nodded her agreement, and they worked together through the afternoon, removing the makeshift window coverings and fitting the new glass panes into the frames. The stove proved more challenging, requiring them to enlarge the chimney opening, but by dusk it was installed and radiating a steady, even heat throughout the cabin. As Yates prepared to leave, Hannah impulsively wrote on her slate, "Stay for supper. Least I can do." He looked genuinely pleased by the invitation. "I'd be honored, Miss Montgomery." Hannah prepared a simple meal of bean stew with salt pork and cornbread baked in the new stove. They ate in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional crackle from the stove and the howl of wind outside. When Yates complimented the food with a simple, "delicious," Hannah found herself smiling slightly before she caught herself. After the meal, as Yates prepared to face the bitter cold for his ride home, he paused at the door. "I've been thinking," he said carefully. "That stream you were working at earlier, it'll freeze solid soon. Hauling water will become difficult." Hannah raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "There's a natural spring on my property that never freezes, even in the coldest weather. I could bring water when I check on you, save you the trouble of breaking ice." Hannah wrote, "I'm not helpless." "Never thought you were," Yates replied quickly. "But even the most capable person can use a helping hand sometimes, especially their first winter in Montana territory." Hannah considered his offer, weighing her pride against practicality. Finally, she wrote, "How often would you come?" "Every few days, if the weather permits. More often if there's a bad storm brewing." Hannah hesitated, then wrote, "All right, but I'll find a way to repay the favor." Yates smiled, a genuine expression that reached his unusual eyes. "Being able to ease my conscience about a neighbor facing winter alone is payment enough." He donned his hat and heavy coat. "I'll be back in 3 days, weather permitting. If you need anything before then, fire 3 shots in the air. I'll hear it from my place if the wind's right." After he left, Hannah stood in her doorway, watching his figure disappear into the darkness. The cabin felt different with the new stove and windows warmer, more secure. But it also felt emptier somehow, in a way she wasn't prepared to examine too closely. True to his word, Yates returned 3 days later with barrels of fresh spring water. He continued his visits throughout December, arriving every 3 days like clockwork, regardless of the weather. Sometimes he brought additional supplies, candles, lamp oil, or books from his personal library when he learned Hannah enjoyed reading. Other times he simply delivered water and stayed for a meal before returning to his own ranch. Hannah maintained her silence around him, communicating only through her slate, but she found herself writing more than was strictly necessary. She asked about his ranch, his background, how he'd come to Montana. In turn, he shared stories of his 12 years in the territory, arriving as a boy of 18 with nothing but determination and a talent for working with horses. He'd built his ranch from nothing, starting with a single mare and gradually breeding a line of horses known for their intelligence and stamina. "They're in demand from here to California," he told her one evening as they sat before the stove. "Army contracts mostly, but I sell to stagecoach companies too." Hannah wrote, "You've accomplished a great deal for someone so young." Yates shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "I'm 30 now. Should have a family by this point, according to my mother's letters." He smiled ruefully. "She's still back east, writing regularly to remind me that I'm failing in my duty to provide her with grandchildren." Hannah found herself wanting to ask why he hadn't married, but the question felt too personal, too close to conversations she'd sworn never to have again. Instead, she wrote, "The territory seems to attract those who prefer independence." "True enough," Yates agreed. "Though I wouldn't say I prefer being alone. Just haven't found the right reason not to be." He glanced at her, then quickly looked away. "What about you, Miss Montgomery? What brought you all the way from Ohio to this particular patch of Montana?" Hannah stiffened. She'd never mentioned Ohio to him. She wrote, "How did you know where I'm from?" Yates had the grace to look sheepish. "Land office in town keeps records of property transfers. The deed showed your previous residence." He hesitated. "I asked about you after our first meeting. Was concerned about a woman alone out here, especially one who—" He trailed off. "One who won't speak to men." Hannah finished on her slate, her writing sharper and more angular than usual. "I apologize if that seems intrusive," Yates said. "Folks out here tend to know each other's business. It's partly neighborliness, partly survival." Hannah considered being angry, but found she lacked the energy for it. After a moment, she wrote, "I came here to start fresh, to be completely independent." Yates nodded, accepting her limited explanation without pressing for more. "Well, you picked a beautiful piece of land, if a challenging one. Come spring, you'll see why I was so interested in those maple trees. The whole grove blooms with the most delicate green, like nothing else in the territory." As January gave way to February, the winter deepened. Snow piled in drifts taller than a man, and temperatures plummeted to levels Hannah had never experienced in Ohio. Without Yates's regular deliveries of water and firewood, she might well have frozen or starved despite her careful preparations. What unsettled her more than the brutal weather, however, was how much she had come to anticipate his visits. She found herself watching the western horizon on the days he was due to arrive, and feeling a sharp disappointment on the few occasions when storms delayed him. This dependence not just on his practical assistance, but on his company troubled her deeply. It ran counter to everything she had promised herself when she left Ohio. One evening in mid-February, after they had shared a meal of rabbit stew from a rabbit Yates had snared on his way to her cabin, Hannah impulsively wrote on her slate, "Why do you keep coming here?" Yates looked startled by the directness of her question. He set down his coffee cup and considered his answer carefully. "At first, it was genuine concern for a neighbor," he said finally. "No one should face their first Montana winter alone." He paused, seeming to debate whether to continue.
"But now?"
"I come because I enjoy your company, Miss Montgomery. Even in silence, you've become the person I most look forward to seeing." Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks. She didn't know how to respond to such honesty. I don't expect anything from you, Yates continued when she didn't write a reply. I respect your reasons for not speaking, whatever they may be. But I hope you'll allow me to keep visiting, even after winter ends and you no longer need water delivered. Hannah stared at her slate, then slowly wrote, I was engaged to be married in Ohio. Yates straightened, clearly surprised by this unexpected confidence. His name was Samuel. Hannah continued writing, her chalk moving rapidly across the slate. I believed he loved me. 2 weeks before our wedding, I discovered he had another fiancée in a neighboring town. He had been courting us both for over a year, telling each of us he was traveling for business when he was actually visiting the other. Yates's expression darkened. The scoundrel. When confronted, he laughed. Hannah wrote, her hand trembling slightly at the memory. Said I should be flattered he chose me in the end, and that what I didn't know wouldn't have hurt me. When I broke the engagement, he told everyone I was hysterical, that I had imagined the whole thing. Many believed him. He was charming, respected in the community. After my parents died, I had no one to stand by me. Yates was silent, his face a study in controlled anger. I swore then that no man would ever again hear my voice or have power over my life, Hannah finished. I sold everything and came here to start anew. I understand, Yates said softly, and I'm sorry for what you endured. No one deserves such betrayal. Hannah hesitated, then wrote, I find myself looking forward to your visits. It frightens me. The honesty of her admission hung in the air between them, as palpable as the heat from the stove. I would never hurt you, Hannah, Yates said, using her given name for the first time. I can promise you that much. But I won't press for more than friendship, if that's all you're willing to give. Hannah nodded, unable to articulate even on her slate the confusion of emotions his words stirred in her. They finished their meal in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than before, charged with unspoken possibilities that both thrilled and terrified her. When Yates left that night, he paused at the door longer than usual. Whatever you decide about us about this, know that I'll respect it. Your friendship these past months has been a gift I never expected. Hannah watched him ride away into the moonlit snow, her heart pounding with a rhythm she'd thought permanently stilled. She closed the door and leaned against it, overwhelmed by the realization that somewhere between autumn and winter, without speaking a single word to him, she had begun to care for Yates Blackwood in a way that threatened every wall she'd built around herself. A blizzard struck 3 days later, the worst of the season. Snow fell so thickly that Hannah could barely see her own hand outstretched before her. The wind howled around her cabin like a living thing, finding every crack and crevice despite her best efforts at weatherproofing. For 2 days, she remained inside, rationing her firewood and listening to the storm rage around her small sanctuary. On the 3rd day, the storm abated enough for Hannah to venture outside and clear a path to her woodpile. The snow reached her waist in places, and the effort of shoveling left her exhausted. By midday, she had cleared only enough space to reach essential areas: the woodpile, the outhouse, and a small area for her 2 chickens to scratch for feed. Yates was now 2 days overdue, but Hannah knew no one would attempt travel in such conditions. She told herself she wasn't worried. He was experienced in winter survival and would have remained safely at his ranch, but as the afternoon waned with no sign of him, anxiety gnawed at her. Just before dusk, as Hannah was preparing to bring in more firewood, she heard a faint whinny. Peering through the fading light, she saw a horse approaching, struggling through the deep snow. The rider slumped in the saddle, barely staying upright. Hannah dropped the wood and ran, forcing her way through the drifts. As she drew closer, she recognized Yates's chestnut gelding, but the animal was without its usual pack of supplies. Yates himself was covered in snow, his face alarmingly pale beneath his frost-encrusted beard. The horse stopped when it reached her, as if knowing its burden needed immediate help. Hannah reached up and touched Yates's arm. He stirred, his eyes opening with visible effort. "Made it," he mumbled through blue-tinged lips. "Worried about you. After the storm." Hannah's heart clenched at the realization that he had risked his life not to bring supplies, but simply to ensure her safety. She helped him down from the saddle, alarmed at how heavily he leaned on her. His clothes were stiff with ice, and he shivered violently. She led him to the cabin, the horse following without guidance. Inside, she sat Yates by the stove and quickly built up the fire. His hands were too numb to manage the buttons of his coat, so Hannah undid them herself, then removed his frozen boots and outer garments. His skin was dangerously cold to the touch. Hannah wrapped him in every blanket she possessed and put water on to boil. When it was ready, she made him drink cup after cup of hot tea sweetened with precious sugar. Gradually, color returned to his face, and his shivering subsided. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. "Shouldn't have tried to make it through the drifts, but I couldn't stop thinking about you here alone." Hannah retrieved her slate and wrote, "Foolish man. You could have died." "Probably," he agreed with a weak smile. "But I've discovered I'm not entirely rational when it comes to you, Miss Montgomery." Hannah frowned at him, but there was no real anger behind it. She wrote, "Rest now. You can return home when you're recovered." Yates glanced out the window at the rapidly darkening sky. "If you don't mind, I think it's too late to start back tonight. The temperature drops quickly after sunset." Hannah nodded her agreement. She had already reached the same conclusion. Her cabin had only the one room, with her narrow bed in the corner, but Yates could sleep near the stove where it was warmest. She wrote this plan on her slate. "I've slept in far worse conditions," Yates assured her. "The floor by your stove is luxury compared to some places I've bedded down." As night fell, Hannah made a pallet for him using spare blankets and her winter coat for additional padding. She served a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, which Yates ate with apparent gratitude. His strength seemed to be returning, though he still moved with the careful deliberation of a man recovering from near freezing. Hannah prepared for sleep with her back turned, changing into her nightdress behind a makeshift screen of hung blankets. When she emerged, Yates was already lying on his pallet, his eyes closed. She slipped into her own bed and extinguished the lamp. In the darkness, with only the red glow from the stove illuminating the cabin, Hannah lay awake listening to Yates's breathing. It was strange having another person in her space after so many months of solitude, yet not uncomfortable. In fact, there was something reassuring about his presence, a sense of security she hadn't realized she was missing. "Hannah." His voice came softly through the darkness. "Are you awake?" She tapped twice on the wooden wall beside her bed, their established signal for yes during evening conversations when writing on the slate was impractical. "I want you to know something," Yates said. "When I was out in that storm, thinking I might not make it through, it wasn't my ranch or my horses I was worried about leaving behind. It was the thought of never seeing you again that kept me fighting forward." Hannah's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to respond, to acknowledge the weight of his confession, but maintained her silence. "You don't have to say anything," Yates continued. "I just needed you to know that. Whatever happens tomorrow or the day after, whether you ever decide to speak to me or not, you've become important to me in a way no one else ever has." Hannah lay perfectly still, tears gathering in her eyes. For the first time since leaving Ohio, she found herself wanting to break her vow, wanting to let words spill from her lips in response to his raw honesty. Instead, she reached for the small wooden box she kept beside her bed, where she stored her most precious possessions. From it, she removed a small handbell she used during summer to scare birds from her garden. She rang it once, softly, the clear tone filling the cabin. "What does that mean?" Yates asked, confusion evident in his voice. Hannah hesitated, then rang it twice more in quick succession. "Is that yes to something?" Yates guessed. "Or just acknowledgement?" Hannah rang it once again, then set it aside. She couldn't bring herself to explain further, not yet. But in her heart, she knew the bell's ring had been her way of saying what she couldn't voice aloud, that he had become equally important to her. Morning brought clear skies and brilliant sunshine that transformed the snowbound landscape into a dazzling, white expanse. Yates seemed fully recovered, though he moved with a stiffness that spoke of muscles sore from his ordeal. He insisted on tending to his horse before accepting breakfast. "He saved my life out there," Yates explained as he pulled on his still damp boots. "Kept going when a lesser animal would have given up." Hannah nodded, understanding the bond between a man and the horse that carried him through such territories. She had a similar connection with the sturdy mare she'd purchased upon arriving in Montana, an animal that had proven its worth during the difficult work of establishing her homestead. When Yates returned from the lean to where his horse had spent the night, his expression was serious. "The drifts are still deep between here and my ranch," he said. "I can make it back, but it would be safer to wait another day for more snow to melt." He looked at her uncertainly. "If that's acceptable to you, of course." Hannah considered the propriety of the situation. Under normal circumstances, an unmarried woman hosting a man overnight would be scandalous. But these were hardly normal circumstances, and there was no one for miles to pass judgment. More importantly, she found she didn't want him to risk the journey yet. She wrote on her slate, "Stay. We can use the time to repair that shelf that's been wobbling." Yates smiled, visibly relieved. "Happy to make myself useful." They spent the day on indoor tasks fixing the aforementioned shelf, reinforcing a loose floorboard, and reorganizing Hannah's stores to create more space in the small cabin. Working together created a domestic rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. By unspoken agreement, they avoided any reference to Yates's confession of the previous night, though Hannah caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that made her pulse quicken. As evening approached, Hannah began preparing dinner, a stew using the last of her fresh vegetables, supplemented with dried herbs and salted beef. Yates sat at her small table, whittling a piece of pine wood into what appeared to be a small animal figure. "My father taught me," he explained when he noticed her watching. "Said a man should always have something useful to do with his hands during the long winter evenings." Hannah nodded and wrote, "What are you making?" "A horse for my foreman's daughter. Her birthday's next month." He held up the half-formed figure, showing the emerging shape of a mare with flowing mane. "She's crazy about horses, follows me around the stables asking questions whenever her father brings her to the ranch." The image of Yates patiently answering a child's endless questions touched something in Hannah. She wrote, "You're good with children?" "I like them," he admitted. "Their honesty. The way they see the world so clearly." He returned his carving, adding carefully, "Always thought I'd have a few of my own by now." Hannah stirred the stew, considering his words. Before Samuel's betrayal, she too had imagined children in her future, had even chosen names in the privacy of her thoughts. Afterward, she had locked away those dreams along with her voice, believing them forever forfeit. They ate dinner in companionable silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional howl of wind outside. Afterward, as Hannah washed the dishes in a basin of heated water, Yates resumed his carving. The quiet domesticity of the scene struck her suddenly how easily they had fallen into sharing this space, this life. When it came time for sleep, they repeated the previous night's arrangements. Hannah changed behind her makeshift screen while Yates prepared his pallet by the stove. As she settled into bed and extinguished the lamp, Hannah found herself less able to maintain the emotional distance she'd cultivated for so long. "Hannah." Yates's voice came through the darkness, just as it had the night before. She tapped twice on the wall. "Thank you for letting me stay. I know it can't be easy having your solitude interrupted like this." Hannah reached for her bell and rang at once, their new signal for disagreement.
"No."
Yates sounded surprised. "You don't mind?" 2 taps for yes. I'm glad, he said softly, because I've never felt more at peace than these past 2 days, despite nearly freezing to death. There was a smile in his voice that Hannah could picture perfectly, though she couldn't see his face in the darkness. She rang the bell once, then twice in quick succession, disagreement followed by agreement. Their private language was evolving, becoming more nuanced. Both yes and no? Yates interpreted. I suppose nearly freezing isn't conducive to peace. Hannah smiled to herself, impressed by how quickly he understood. She tapped twice. You know, Yates said after a moment, I've been thinking about what you told me. About why you don't speak to men. He paused. I want you to know that I understand keeping your vow. There's honor in that, even if what prompted it was dishonorable. Hannah listened, her heart beating faster. But I also believe that giving someone the power to silence you forever means they're still controlling your life, even from a distance. His voice was gentle, not accusing. Just something to consider. Hannah lay still, absorbing his words. She had never thought of her silence that way, as a continuation of Samuel's influence rather than a rejection of it. The idea was unsettling. I'm sorry, Yates said when she didn't respond. It's not my place to question your choices. Hannah reached for the bell and rang it once. No, he hadn't overstepped. His observation had struck too close to a truth she hadn't been ready to face. Sleep came slowly that night, her mind churning with thoughts she'd kept at bay for months. By dawn, Hannah had reached no conclusions, but something had shifted inside her, a loosening of the rigid principles that had guided her since leaving Ohio. The next day brought warmer temperatures that accelerated the snow melt. By mid-morning, it was clear Yates could safely return to his ranch. Hannah found herself inventing reasons for him to delay a door hinge that needed oiling, firewood that needed stacking, but eventually, there was nothing left to repair or organize. As Yates prepared his horse for the journey home, Hannah stood in the doorway of her cabin, a strange emptiness expanding in her chest. She would see him again in a few days when he resumed his regular visits, yet this departure felt significant in ways she couldn't articulate. Yates mounted his gelding and adjusted his hat against the bright morning sun. I'll be back soon with more supplies, he promised. And Hannah. He hesitated, then continued with quiet intensity. Thank you for sharing your home with me. These past days have meant more than I can express. Hannah nodded, unable to meet his eyes for fear of what her own might reveal. She held up her slate with what she had written earlier. Travel safely. Yates touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then turned his horse toward the west. Hannah watched until horse and rider disappeared over the ridge, then returned to her silent cabin. It seemed smaller somehow, and infinitely emptier than before. The days that followed were filled with a restlessness Hannah couldn't seem to shake. She went about her usual tasks, tending her chickens, preserving the last of her winter stores, mending clothes, but her thoughts constantly strayed to Yates. She found herself replaying their conversations, remembering the warmth in his unusual eyes when he looked at her, the careful way he respected her boundaries while gently challenging the walls she'd built. When he returned 3 days later with fresh supplies, Hannah felt an almost painful surge of joy at the sight of him cresting the ridge. She schooled her features into a more neutral expression by the time he reached her door, but something must have shone in her eyes because Yates's smile widened as he dismounted. You're looking well, Miss Montgomery, he said, the formality belied by the warmth in his voice. Hannah nodded and took the packages he offered: fresh coffee, sugar, and to her surprise, a small bundle of early spring flowers. She raised an eyebrow in question. Found them on a south-facing slope, Yates explained. First blooms of the season. Thought you might like a touch of spring after all this winter white. Hannah fingered the delicate purple blossoms, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. She wrote on her slate, "They're beautiful. Thank you." That visit marked a shift in their relationship. Though Hannah maintained her silence, She found herself communicating more freely through her slate, asking questions about Yates's life and sharing cautious fragments of her own past. She learned that he had come to Montana after his father's death, determined to build something that would have made the old man proud. In turn, she told him about growing up on her parents' farm in Ohio, about her mother teaching her to read using poetry books ordered from Cincinnati, about her father's talent for coaxing music from a battered fiddle on winter evenings. As March gave way to April, the snow retreated from the lower elevations, revealing the first tender shoots of new grass. The stream thawed, eliminating the need for Yates to deliver water, yet still he came every few days, always with some small gift or useful item. Hannah began to anticipate not just his arrival but the moment of his departure, when he would pause, seemingly on the verge of saying something significant, before tipping his hat and riding away. One afternoon in mid-April, Yates arrived with 2 maple tapping kits strapped to his saddle. "The sap will be running soon," he explained. "Thought I might show you how to tap those maples we talked about. The syrup will fetch a good price in town, or you can keep it for your own use." Hannah wrote, "I'd like to learn." They spent the afternoon in the maple grove, with Yates demonstrating how to drill holes in the trunks at just the right angle and depth, how to insert the spiles and hang the collection buckets. Hannah proved a quick study, soon working as efficiently as Yates himself. "You'll need to check the buckets daily," Yates explained as they finished the last tree. "Then boil down the sap. It takes about 40 gallons to make 1 gallon of syrup." Hannah wrote, "Seems like a lot of work for a small return." "Most worthwhile things are," Yates replied, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that suggested he wasn't just talking about maple syrup. Hannah looked away first, her heart racing. She wrote, "Will you stay for dinner?" "I'd be honored," Yates said. "But first, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Hannah waited, suddenly apprehensive. "There's a spring social in town next weekend. Dancing, food, the whole community gathering to celebrate making it through another winter." He cleared his throat. "I was hoping you might consider attending. With me." Hannah stared at him, then at her slate. The thought of going into town, of being surrounded by strangers who would inevitably question why she didn't speak, filled her with dread. She wrote, "I can't." "You can," Yates countered gently. "You don't have to speak to anyone. I'd be right beside you the whole time." Hannah shook her head firmly and wrote, "People would stare. Talk about the mute woman." "Perhaps at first," Yates acknowledged. "But folks around here are generally respectful of privacy. Most have their own reasons for coming to the territory, their own pasts they'd rather not discuss." Hannah remained unconvinced. She wrote, "I'm sorry. I'm not ready." "I understand," Yates said, though disappointment shadowed his eyes. "The invitation stands if you change your mind." They walked back to the cabin in silence, the joy of their shared afternoon diminished by the uncomfortable reminder of the barriers that still existed between them. Hannah prepared a simple meal, but the easy companionship they had developed seemed strained for the first time in weeks. As Yates prepared to leave, earlier than usual, Hannah felt a sudden panic at the thought that she had damaged something precious. She hastily wrote on her slate, "I'm not rejecting you. Just the social." Yates read it, and his expression softened. "I know, Hannah. And I meant what I said about understanding. We all move at our own pace." He hesitated, then added, "I just hope someday you'll trust me enough to take a risk. Even a small one." After he left, Hannah sat on her porch steps as twilight gathered around her cabin. In the distance, the maple grove stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, the trees they had tapped together now connected to them both. She thought about Yates's words about trust and risk, about moving at her own pace. The truth was, she had already taken risks with him that she'd never imagined taking with any man again. She had allowed him into her home, her daily life, even some of the protected corners of her heart. Yet she clung to her silence like a shield, afraid of what might happen if she lowered it completely. As darkness fell, Hannah made a decision. She wouldn't attend the spring social. That was still too much, too soon. But perhaps there was another risk she could take, a different way to show Yates that his patience wasn't in vain. The sap began flowing 3 days later, and Hannah spent hours collecting and boiling it down as Yates had taught her. The process was labor-intensive but satisfying, filling her cabin with sweet steam and resulting in jars of amber syrup more delicious than anything she'd tasted before. When Yates next visited, she presented him with the first jar, carefully labeled in her neat handwriting. From Hannah's Maples. It was the first time she had referred to herself by name in his presence, a small but deliberate intimacy. Yates noticed immediately. Hannah's Maples, he read aloud, a smile spreading across his face. I like the sound of that, she wrote. Me too. Thank you for teaching me. My pleasure, he said, holding the jar up to the light to admire the color. This is perfect timing, actually. I have something to ask you. Hannah waited, curious. The spring social is tomorrow night, Yates said. I know you said you weren't ready, and I respect that. But I had another thought. He set down the syrup and looked at her directly. Would you consider having dinner with me? At my ranch. Just the two of us. Hannah's pulse quickened. This was different from their meals together at her cabin, more intentional, more like a proper courtship. She wrote, like a supper party? Like a supper for two people who've grown to care for each other, Yates clarified softly. No pressure to speak. No expectations beyond enjoying a meal in a different setting. Hannah considered the invitation. She was curious about Yates's home, about seeing the ranch he'd built from nothing. And the prospect of an evening solely in his company, away from her own four walls, held an undeniable appeal. She wrote, I'd like that. Yates's face lit up with a smile that made Hannah's heart skip. Wonderful. I'll come for you at 5 tomorrow. Wear something nice if you'd like, not that you need to dress up for me, but... He trailed off, seemingly embarrassed by his own enthusiasm. Hannah found his nervousness endearing. She wrote, I'll find something suitable. After Yates left, Hannah opened the trunk containing the few personal items she'd brought from Ohio. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, lay the one fine dress she'd kept, a deep blue silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. She had worn it only once, to a harvest festival the autumn before Samuel's betrayal was revealed. Hannah had nearly left it behind when she fled Ohio, considering it a reminder of a life she wanted to forget. Now, she was glad she had preserved this one beautiful thing from her past. The following evening, Hannah was ready when Yates arrived with a buggy instead of his usual mount. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance. His usually wind-tousled hair was neatly combed, and he wore a crisp white shirt beneath a well-cut jacket. When he saw Hannah in her blue dress, he momentarily lost his composure. You look beautiful, he said simply. Hannah felt herself blush. She had arranged her hair more carefully than usual and even applied a touch of rouge she'd nearly forgotten she possessed. She nodded her thanks and allowed Yates to help her into the buggy. The ride to his ranch took nearly an hour, following a winding trail through hills beginning to green with spring growth. As they crested a final ridge, Hannah caught her breath at the sight spread before them. Yates's spread was more substantial than she had imagined, a large main house of squared logs, several outbuildings, and a series of corrals containing horses of varying colors and sizes. Beyond the buildings stretched fenced pastures and what appeared to be recently plowed fields. Home, Yates said, a note of pride in his voice. Built most of it myself, with help from my hands during the off-seasons. Hannah wrote on the small portable slate she had brought. It's impressive. It's still growing, Yates replied as he guided the buggy down the slope toward the ranch. Another few years, and I hope to double the size of the herd. As they approached the main house, an elderly woman emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. Yates had mentioned his housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, in previous conversations a widow who had come west with her husband years ago and stayed on after his death to work for various ranches in the territory. Right on time, the woman called as Yates helped Hannah down from the buggy. "Supper's nearly ready." "Mrs. Abernathy, this is Miss Hannah Montgomery," Yates said. "Hannah, this is Mrs. Abernathy, the finest cook in the territory and the reason my ranch hands never seek employment elsewhere." The older woman snorted at this flattery, but smiled warmly at Hannah.
"Pleased to meet you, miss."
"Mr. Blackwood has spoken of little else but you for months now." Hannah nodded in greeting, suddenly nervous about how to navigate a conversation with someone new. Yates must have sensed her discomfort because he quickly explained, "Miss Montgomery prefers written communication. A personal choice I greatly respect." To Hannah's relief, Mrs. Abernathy accepted this without question. "Well, the written word has served mankind well enough for centuries," she said practically. "Now come inside before the roast dries out. I wasn't about to let Mr. Blackwood cook for his first proper guest." The interior of Yates's home surprised Hannah. She had expected a bachelor's Spartan quarters, but instead found comfortable, well-crafted furniture, bookshelves lined with volumes, and curtains at the windows that matched the upholstery of the chairs. It was a home built with permanence in mind, not a temporary shelter. Dinner was served in a small dining room adjacent to the kitchen. Mrs. Abernathy had outdone herself with a meal that included roast beef, potatoes, fresh spring greens, and warm bread that filled the room with its yeasty aroma. For dessert, there was apple pie with cream, a luxury Hannah hadn't tasted since leaving Ohio. Throughout the meal, Yates kept the conversation flowing easily, requiring only occasional written responses from Hannah. He told stories about the early days of establishing his ranch, about the first mare he'd purchased, and how she'd outsmarted him at every turn until they reached a mutual understanding. "She still lives in the north pasture," he said. "Too old for riding now, but she oversees the younger horses like a schoolmarm with unruly children." After dinner, Mrs. Abernathy discreetly withdrew to her quarters in a separate wing of the house, leaving Yates and Hannah alone. He offered to show her the rest of the main house, and Hannah nodded her acceptance. The tour was brief. The house was large by territory standards, but still modest compared to some Eastern homes. There was Yates's study, filled with books and papers related to horse breeding and ranch management, a comfortable parlor rarely used except when business associates visited, and a small music room containing a piano that Yates admitted he couldn't play. "It came with the property," he explained. "The previous owner's wife was musically inclined, apparently. I've kept it tuned, though. Something about a house with music in it feels more alive." Hannah approached the instrument, running her fingers lightly over the keys. She wrote, "I used to play. Not well, but enough for simple songs. Would you?" Yates hesitated. "I'd love to hear it someday. When you're ready." Hannah nodded, acknowledging his careful phrasing, "when you're ready," not if. The distinction wasn't lost on her. As the evening drew to a close, they stood on the porch watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. The spring air carried a lingering chill, and Hannah found herself moving closer to Yates for warmth. He noticed and tentatively placed an arm around her shoulders. "Is this all right?" he asked softly. Hannah nodded, leaning slightly into his embrace. The contact was both foreign and familiar. Foreign because she had allowed no man to touch her since Samuel. Familiar because something about Yates's presence had always felt like coming home, even from their first contentious meeting. "Hannah," Yates said after a long moment of companionable silence, "I need to tell you something, and I hope you'll hear me out before responding." Hannah tensed slightly, but nodded for him to continue. "These past months, getting to know you, have been the most meaningful of my life," Yates began. "I admire your strength, your independence, your determination to forge your own path regardless of convention." He paused, gathering his thoughts. I understand why you've chosen silence, and I respect the principles behind that choice. But I want you to know that whatever happens between us, however you choose to communicate, my feelings for you won't change. Hannah looked up at him, her heart racing. I'm in love with you, Hannah Montgomery, Yates said simply. I think I have been since that first day, when you stood beside your collapsed cellar, covered in mud and glaring at me like I was the devil himself. A startled laugh escaped Hannah before she could prevent it, a small sound, barely more than a breath, but unmistakably a laugh. Yates's eyes widened at the sound. You don't need to say anything, he continued quickly. I don't expect you to return my feelings or to change your ways for me. I just couldn't go another day without telling you the truth. Hannah reached for her slate, but the words that formed in her mind seemed inadequate for the moment. Instead, she did something that surprised them both. She stood on tiptoe and pressed her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief, almost tentative, but it conveyed what her silence and written words could not, that his feelings were not unrequited, that the walls around her heart had begun to crumble, that she too had found something unexpected and precious in their time together. When they parted, Yates looked at her with wonder. Hannah. She placed a finger against his lips, then wrote on her slate. Take me home. I need time to think. The ride back to her cabin was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with new possibilities. When they arrived, Yates helped her down from the buggy and walked her to her door. Thank you for coming tonight, he said. Whatever you decide, know that nothing needs to change unless you want it to. Hannah nodded, then impulsively reached for his hand and squeezed it briefly before entering her cabin. Inside, she leaned against the closed door, her mind and heart racing with the implications of the evening. For the first time since leaving Ohio, Hannah allowed herself to imagine a future different from the solitary existence. She had planned a future that included Yates, his ranch, perhaps even the family he had mentioned wanting. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. She moved to her small window and watched as Yates's buggy disappeared into the night, her fingers unconsciously touching her lips where they had met his. The kiss had been a breach in her carefully constructed defenses, but instead of feeling vulnerable, Hannah felt strangely liberated, as if in that brief moment of connection, she had reclaimed something that Samuel's betrayal had stolen from her. Hannah slept little that night, her thoughts circling around Yates's declaration and her own conflicted response. By dawn, she had reached no definitive conclusion, but she knew one thing with certainty. The vow she had made in the aftermath of heartbreak no longer fit the woman she had become in Montana. Whether or not she chose to break her silence, she would not allow Samuel's ghost to dictate her future happiness. The next week passed in a blur of activity as spring took firm hold of the landscape. The maple sap flowed abundantly, keeping Hannah busy with collection and boiling. Yates continued his regular visits, but maintained a respectful distance, never pressing for a response to his declaration. The unspoken feelings between them charged the air whenever they were together, yet Hannah found herself grateful for his patience as she sorted through her complicated emotions. One afternoon, as Hannah was tending her newly planted vegetable garden, she heard the now familiar sound of hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she expected to see Yates, but instead saw a stranger riding toward her cabin, a well-dressed man on an expensive-looking bay horse. Hannah straightened, brushing dirt from her hands and reaching for the slate she now kept constantly at her side. As the rider drew closer, something about his posture, the set of his shoulders, triggered a memory that sent ice through her veins. It couldn't be. Not here, not after all this time. But as the man removed his hat in greeting, Hannah's worst fear was confirmed. Samuel Jenkins had found her. Hannah, he called, his voice as smooth and confident as she remembered. What an extraordinary coincidence. I was passing through on business, and heard talk in town of a woman living alone who didn't speak. I could scarcely believe it might be you. Hannah stood frozen, her slate clutched in white-knuckled hands. Samuel dismounted and approached with the easy assurance of a man accustomed to getting his way. "You're looking well," he continued as if they were old friends meeting after a brief separation. "The mountain air agrees with you." His eyes swept over her property with obvious assessment. "Though I must say, this is hardly what I expected. A woman of your background, living in such rustic conditions." Hannah finally broke from her paralysis and wrote rapidly on her slate. "Leave. You're not welcome here." Samuel read it and laughed that same dismissive laugh that had haunted her memories. "Still maintaining that ridiculous silent treatment, I see." "Really, Hannah, haven't you punished me enough? It's been over a year." Hannah wrote again. "This is my property. Leave now or I'll—" "You'll what?" Samuel interrupted, his amusement fading to something harder. "Shoot me? Call for help? We both know you're alone out here." He sighed dramatically. "I didn't come to argue, Hannah. I came to make amends. To offer you a way back to civilization." Hannah stared at him in disbelief. "Things didn't work out with Caroline," Samuel continued, naming the woman he'd been courting simultaneously with Hannah. "She proved unsuitable as a wife. I've had time to reflect on my behavior, and I realize now that you were the better choice all along." Hannah felt sick at his casual cruelty, at the assumption that she would be waiting for him to reconsider her worth. "I'm prepared to forgive your dramatic departure," Samuel said magnanimously. "We can return to Ohio, be married as planned. Put this unfortunate episode behind us." Hannah's hand shook with rage as she wrote, "I would rather die than marry you." Samuel's expression darkened. "Don't be foolish, Hannah. Look at you, a woman alone in the wilderness, reduced to writing like a schoolchild because of some misguided principle. What kind of life is this? A better one than any you could offer." The new voice came from behind Hannah, and she turned to see Yates approaching on foot from the direction of the maple grove. He must have left his horse tethered there while checking the sap buckets. "And you are?" Samuel asked coldly. "Yates Blackwood, Hannah's neighbor." Yates moved to stand beside Hannah, not touching her but close enough that his presence felt like a shield. "And you appear to be an unwelcome visitor." Samuel's eyes narrowed as he assessed the newcomer. "This is a private conversation between myself and my fiancé." "Ex-fiancé," Yates corrected mildly, though Hannah could sense the tension in him. "And from what I overheard, the lady has made her wishes clear. She wants you to leave." Samuel's face flushed with anger. "I don't know what lies Hannah has told you. She hasn't needed to tell me anything," Yates interrupted. "Your character is evident in your behavior." He glanced at Hannah. "Are you all right?" Hannah nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence. "Miss Montgomery has made her decision," Yates told Samuel. "I suggest you respect it and be on your way." Samuel looked from Yates to Hannah, his expression calculating. "I see. Found yourself a replacement already, have you, Hannah? Does he know your damaged goods? That you're incapable of trusting a man enough to even speak to him?" Hannah flinched at the deliberate cruelty, but before she could respond, Yates stepped forward, his usually genial face hardened into something dangerous. "I know everything I need to know about Hannah Montgomery," he said, his voice deceptively quiet. "She's the strongest, most principled person I've ever met. And whatever happened between you two, it's clear to me that she made the right choice in leaving." He paused, then added with deadly softness, "Now, I'm asking politely one last time. Get on your horse and ride away." For a tense moment, Hannah thought Samuel might refuse. Then, apparently recognizing the implacable resolve in Yates's stance, he gave a dismissive shrug. "She's not worth the trouble anyway," he said with calculated indifference. "Always was too stubborn for her own good." He turned to Hannah. "When you tire of playing pioneer and come to your senses, you know where to find me." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away without a backward glance. Hannah watched him go, feeling strangely hollow. The confrontation she had dreaded for so long had come and gone, leaving her not devastated as she had feared, but oddly empty, as if Samuel had lost the power to truly hurt her somewhere along the way. Hannah. Yates's voice was gentle, recalling her to the present. Are you truly all right? She nodded slowly, then wrote on her slate. I never expected to see him again. I gathered that was your former fiancé, Yates said. The one who, yes, Hannah wrote. Samuel Jenkins. If I overstepped just now, I apologize, Yates said. When I heard how he was speaking to you, I couldn't stay back. Hannah shook her head and wrote, Thank you for being here. They walked to the cabin in silence, both processing the unexpected encounter. Inside, Hannah sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted by the emotional confrontation. Yates remained standing, watching her with concern. Can I get you anything? Water? Yeah. Hannah shook her head, then wrote, Just stay a while. Please. Yates nodded and took the chair opposite her. They sat in silence as the afternoon light slanted through Hannah's windows, casting long shadows across the plank floor. Hannah's mind was racing, replaying not just the confrontation with Samuel, but the stark contrast between the two men, Samuel's entitlement and casual cruelty against Yates's steadfast respect and protective instinct. Finally, she wrote, He thought I would go back with him. After everything. Some men can't imagine a woman choosing independence over their company, Yates replied, his contempt for Samuel evident in his tone. Especially a man like that, who clearly values his own importance above all else. Hannah nodded, then added, I feared seeing him again for so long. I thought I would feel broken, but I didn't. What did you feel? Yates asked softly. Hannah considered the question, searching for honesty. She wrote, Anger.
Disgust.
But mostly nothing. He seems smaller than I remembered. Less significant. You've outgrown him, Yates suggested. Build a life that has no space for men like Samuel Jenkins. Hannah looked up at him, struck by the simple truth of his words. She had outgrown not just Samuel, but the woman she had been with him, the trusting, naive girl who had believed love came with guarantees. In her place stood a woman who had crossed a continent alone, who had survived a Montana winter, who had built something from nothing using only her own 2 hands. And alongside that strength, she had found something unexpected, a capacity for trust that she thought had been permanently destroyed. Trust in Yates, in his unwavering respect for her choices, in the feelings that had grown between them despite her best efforts to remain emotionally isolated. Hannah set aside her slate and stood. Yates rose as well, watching her with a question in his eyes. She moved toward him slowly, deliberately, until they stood face to face. Thank you, she said, her voice rough from disuse, but clear in the quiet cabin. For being the man who showed me not all men are like him. Yates's eyes widened at the sound of her voice, the first words she had spoken directly to a man in over a year. For a moment, he seemed unable to respond. Hannah, he finally managed, her name like a prayer on his lips. Your voice is mine to give or withhold, she finished for him. And I choose to give it to you, Yates Blackwood. Because you earned it through kindness, not demanded it as your due. Yates reached for her hands, holding them gently between his own. I don't know what to say, except that hearing you speak my name is the greatest gift I've ever received. It feels strange, Hannah admitted, the words coming easier now. But right somehow, like putting down a burden I've carried too long. Does this mean? Yates left the question unfinished, but Hannah understood what he was asking. It means I'm ready to move forward, she said carefully. To explore what's between us without the barrier of my silence.
But slowly, Yates.
I'm still learning to trust again. We have all the time in the world, Yates assured her. I'm not going anywhere, Hannah Montgomery. Not unless you're by my side. Hannah felt tears spring to her eyes, not tears of sorrow or fear, but of release. The vow she had made in pain had served its purpose, protecting her when she needed protection. Now, like a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis, she was ready to test new wings. "Stay for dinner?" she asked, her voice gaining strength with use. "I'd like to practice talking. I have a year's worth of words saved up." Yates laughed, the sound full of joy and promise. "I can't think of anything I'd rather do than listen." As the sun set over the Montana hills, casting golden light through Hannah's windows, she and Yates sat at her small table, sharing a meal and conversation. Hannah's voice grew steadier as the evening progressed, though she sometimes reverted to her slate when emotions made speaking difficult. Yates listened with infinite patience, responding to her halting words with the same attentiveness he had shown her written communication. By the time he left, night had fallen completely, wrapping the landscape in velvety darkness pierced by countless stars. At the door, Yates took her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to her palm. "Good night, Hannah," he said. "Thank you for trusting me with your voice." "Good night, Yates," she replied, the simple exchange filling her with quiet wonder at how far she had come since that stormy autumn day when she had first staked her claim on this land and, unknowingly, on a future brighter than she had dared to imagine. Spring gave way to summer, and Hannah's small homestead flourished under her care. The vegetable garden produced abundantly, her chickens multiplied, and the maple syrup she and Yates had made together fetched an excellent price in town. More importantly, Hannah herself blossomed, gradually reclaiming her voice not just with Yates, but in cautious interactions with others, Mrs. Abernathy, Elijah, and eventually even shopkeepers in the nearby settlement. Her relationship with Yates deepened with each passing week. They established a pattern of alternating visits, Hannah joining him at his ranch for Sunday dinners, Yates coming to her cabin several evenings a week to help with projects or simply to share conversation as twilight settled over the land. They spoke of their pasts, their hopes for the future, and the unexpected joy they had found in each other. By midsummer, Hannah had accepted Yates's invitation to attend a community gathering, a 4th of July celebration in town. Though nervous about socializing after so long in relative isolation, she found the townspeople welcoming and largely uncurious about her previous silence. It seemed Yates had been right about the territory attracting those who respected privacy and second chances. As August ripened the wheat in nearby fields, Yates asked Hannah to accompany him on a special ride. He arrived at her cabin early one morning, leading not only his own mount but also a beautiful Palomino mare Hannah had admired at his ranch. "She's yours," Yates said when Hannah exclaimed over the animal. "If you'd like her. I've been training her specially these past few months." Hannah ran a gentle hand along the mare's golden neck. "She's magnificent, Yates. But I can't accept such an expensive gift." "Consider her payment for the maple syrup," Yates suggested with a smile. "Or for putting up with my constant visits. Either way, she's meant for you." "Her name is Sunrise, but you can change it if you prefer." "Sunrise is perfect," Hannah said, already in love with the gentle-eyed mare. "Thank you." They rode west from Hannah's cabin, following game trails through hills adorned with late summer wildflowers. Yates led the way, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing stories about the early days of his ranching venture. Hannah found herself more at ease on horseback than she had expected, Sunrise responding to the lightest touch of rein or pressure of knee. After about an hour's ride, they crested a ridge that offered a spectacular view of the surrounding landscape. To the west lay Yates's ranch, visible as a cluster of buildings in the distance. To the north rose mountains still capped with snow despite the summer heat. Eastward, Hannah could just make out the chimney of her own cabin, a small vertical line against the rolling hills. Yates dismounted and helped Hannah down from Sunrise. He spread a blanket on a grassy patch and produced a picnic from his saddlebags: cold chicken, fresh bread, summer berries, and a bottle of wine carefully packed in damp cloths to keep it cool. "This is wonderful," Hannah said as they settled on the blanket. "I've never seen the territory from this vantage point. It's breathtaking." "I found this spot during my first year here," Yates explained. "I was tracking a stray calf and stumbled upon it by accident. Ever since, I've come here when I need to think or make important decisions." He poured wine into 2 tin cups. "It seemed the right place to bring you today." Something in his tone made Hannah look at him more closely. There was a nervousness about him she hadn't seen before, a tension in the way he held himself. "Yates? Is everything all right?" He set aside his cup and took her hands in his. "Hannah, these past months have been the happiest of my life. Watching you reclaim your voice, your confidence, seeing you bloom like the wildflowers after spring rain, it's been a privilege I never expected when I first rode up to your collapsed cellar." Hannah felt her heart begin to race. "I feel the same," she said softly. "You showed me that one man's betrayal didn't have to define my future. I've brought you here today because this place represents possibility to me," Yates continued. "From here, I can see not just what is, but what could be." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "Hannah Montgomery, I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" He opened the box to reveal a ring, not an ostentatious diamond like the one Samuel had given her, but a simple gold band inset with a small pearl surrounded by tiny sapphires that matched her blue dress from their first dinner together. Hannah looked from the ring to Yates's face, seeing in his eyes all the steadfast care, respect, and love he had shown her since their first meeting. She thought of how far she had come from the wounded, silent woman who had arrived in Montana determined to need no one, especially no man. She thought of the future stretching before them, a future bright with possibilities she had once believed forever closed to her. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain in the summer air. "Yes, Yates Blackwood, I will marry you." His face transformed with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, catching the sunlight in flashes of gold and blue. Yates pulled her close and kissed her with a tenderness that made Hannah's heart swell. When they finally parted, Hannah rested her forehead against his. "I never thought I'd find this again, trust, love, hope for a shared future. You gave that back to me, Yates." "You found it yourself," Yates corrected gently. "I just had the good fortune to be the man you found it with." They remained on the ridge through the afternoon, planning their future together. They would marry in the autumn, after the harvest. Hannah would keep her land. A wise woman always has something of her own, Yates insisted, but make her home with Yates at the ranch. Together they would expand both properties, combining Hannah's skill with crops and Yates's expertise with horses to build something greater than either could achieve alone. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they packed the remains of their picnic and mounted their horses for the return journey. Hannah cast one last look at the panoramic view at her past and future spread before her in miles of Montana wilderness. "Ready?" Yates asked, drawing his horse alongside hers. Hannah nodded, her heart full. "Ready." They married on a crisp October day beneath the maple trees on Hannah's property, the leaves a canopy of red and gold above them. The ceremony was small but joyful, attended by friends from town and hands from Yates's ranch. Hannah wore her blue silk dress, newly altered by Mrs. Abernathy to suit the occasion, and carried a bouquet of late wildflowers gathered that morning from the ridge where Yates had proposed. Most meaningful to Hannah was the moment when she spoke her vows aloud, her voice strong and clear in the autumn air, not just to Yates, but before all assembled. It was the final reclamation of something she had surrendered in pain, now freely given in love. "I, Hannah Montgomery, take you, Yates Blackwood, to be my husband," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "I promise to trust you, support you, and love you through all the seasons of our life together, come what may. Yates's voice broke slightly as he responded with his own vows, his hands warm around hers, his eyes alight with a happiness that matched her own. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the assembled guests broke into cheers and applause. Elijah produced a fiddle and struck up a lively tune, and the celebration continued into evening with dancing and feasting beneath lanterns hung from the maple branches. Later, as Hannah and Yates rode toward the ranch toward home in the silver light of a full harvest moon, Hannah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the broken, silent woman who had claimed this land in defiance of a painful past, to the woman now riding beside the man who had taught her to trust again, it was a transformation she could never have imagined when she first set foot in Montana territory. "What are you thinking?" Yates asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "I was thinking about promises," Hannah replied. "About the one I made to never speak to a man again, and how breaking it led to the most important promise I've ever made, the one I just made to you." Yates reached across the space between their horses to take her hand. "Some vows are meant to protect us until we're strong enough to stand without them," he said. "You outgrew that first promise, Hannah. You became more than the pain that prompted it." Hannah squeezed his hand, marveling at the wisdom of this man who had seen value in her even when she had walled herself away from the world. "I love you, Yates Blackwood," she said, the words still new enough to fill her with wonder. "Thank you for showing me there was still goodness to be found in men, in the world, and in myself." As they rode the final distance to the ranch house windows glowing with welcoming light, a future bright with promise awaiting them, Hannah knew with absolute certainty that some journeys, no matter how difficult their beginning, led exactly where they were meant to. And 10 years later, when she and Yates sat on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching their 3 children play beneath the same maple trees where they had exchanged their vows, Hannah was grateful beyond words for the twist of fate that had brought a stubborn cowboy to her homestead on that stormy autumn day, the man who had helped her find her voice again, and with it, a love stronger than silence.